Case Western Reserve University's Great Thinker Series proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. These lectures are presented by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream, with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Scott Simpson, Associate Professor of Anatomy at the School of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University and a Fellow of the Institute for the Science of Origins, to launch our three-part series on our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals, Kissing Cousins. Please welcome Dr. Simpson.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to talking with you about some aspects of our evolutionary history. Tonight we're going to talk about Neanderthals. And Neanderthals are always curious to all of us. It's one of the first human ancestors we've ever become familiar with, that we learned about. It was the first ancient human ancestor that we had any fossil evidence for. And I think it's very curious to us to think about Neanderthals because in so many ways they're like us. They walk on two legs. They have a big brain. They use tools. They live cold climates like we do here in Ohio. But what they also do is they're also very different from us in the sense that they lived so long ago. They didn't have the same type of symbolic activities that we had. They are extinct, and they lived amongst animals that are also extinct. And so there's this similarity with this, but there's also this difference. And I'd really like to just talk a little bit about Neanderthals because, you know, they're our cousins. We should know something about them. And as the title says, they're a little closer than we originally thought. They can be kissing cousins. To begin our discussion on Neanderthals, discussions like this always begin with Darwin. And one of the reasons we always begin with Darwin is because he was truly a great mind. And what he did was, by his discussion of providing a mechanism for evolution via natural selection in the 19th century, what he did was he really provided a context for looking at adaptations in humans and all other animals. He also gave the idea that the changes that we see in living animals are a product of very long adaptive histories. And he also provided the idea that humans were also a product of natural selection and evolution, and so that we were a part of the natural kingdom. And so therefore, all the same tools that we could use to study other animals, we could bring together and study ourselves. That includes looking into our ancient history. Now, one of the things that we see in Darwin's Origin of Species, he's got a diagram like this. And what this is, we can think of it as being a phylogeny. On the vertical axis, what it represents is time. So the oldest are at the bottom of the slide, and the newest, or recent, is at the top of the slide. And each one of these lines represents a different biological lineage. And so we can see that along this lineages, what they do is they have nodes that split and divide. So that those are aspects of speciation. When the lines stop, that's extinction. And we can see that by the splitting that some animals are more close related to each other than other animals. And so consequently, what we can do is we can apply these types of tools of change over time, of similarity between species, and the fact that there is an historical record to our history, and apply that to modern humans. And so as we look at, so if we quote from Darwin from his Origin of Species, we can say that looking not to any one time, but to all time, if my theory be true, numberless intermediate varieties linking most closely all the species of the same group together must surely have existed. So that means that they're our ancestors. Consequently, evidence of their former existence could be found only amongst fossil remains, which are preserved in an extremely imperfect and intermediate record. Therefore, our history is knowable. And we can know these things by going out and looking for evidence of our ancient ancestors. Now, this was written in 1859, and Darwin, although he made mention of human evolution, really wasn't a very strong record of the fossil record for human evolution. And what we find is, at this time in 1859, there were 3 Neanderthal specimens that were known, 3 ancient human ancestors from Europe. There were Engis in Belgium that was found about 1829 or in the early 1830s. There was Gibraltar in southern Spain. And then there was also the Neander Valley in Germany, or the Neanderthal in Germany. And it's this bottom specimen that we see, the skeleton, partial skeleton that we see, that lent its name to Neanderthal. And so some of the aspects of of the early anatomists, when they looked at these fossil remains, they recognized that they weren't exactly identical to modern humans, but then the idea, if these were ancient ancestors, we could see them be more primitive in some ways. And just as a quick introduction to Neanderthals, we can just look at the skull. And here we have a picture from, this is from the Neander Valley. This is the first Neanderthal specimen. And just we can see that even though it has a brain size that's a little larger, actually, than ours, what it does is the shape of its vault is different. It's got a long, low cranial vault. It has very big brow ridges. And so these anatomical characteristics seem to describe or be exhibited in all of these early fossils that we had in the mid-19th century. Now, during the 19th century, there was a great push by European scholars to find out the ancient Europeans. They wanted to figure out where they came from. And so this led them to be looking lots of different places as archaeologists by looking at open-air sites, but also looking for remains of ancient ancestors in the cave sites that are throughout Europe. And some of the things that they found there in their excavations were these ancient stone tools. Now, this is illustration of some stone tools. And these are rocks that have been broken or knapped to create sharp edges, forming a variety of well-defined tool types, like Acheulean hand axes or level points, or that define blades or scrapers and things. But you can see that this is a very ancient type of technology, because now supplanted by using metal tools, among other things. So what we can find is this was, since there was no evidence of steel or iron or copper or bronze in these periods, it must be very ancient. And other evidence of the ancientness of these deposits were the fact that these early stone tools were found in association with extinct animals. So it's clear that these animals, or that these stone tools and the stone tool makers that were found in association with them, were something that was very, very, very old, and perhaps was getting to the idea of what these earliest Europeans were like. And so in the Neanderthals, the early stage of the Neanderthals, they were seen almost as noble, because if modern Europeans are noble, then ancient Europeans must be noble too. And so even though they didn't look exactly like the modern Europeans did, they were our ancestors, and so they were embraced. And so we can see here's an illustration of Neanderthals that was published in 1873. And so it's characteristically they're in the cave, but they're erect standing, sort of intelligent look on their face, although their face and skull is a little different than modern humans, reflecting the anatomy of the Neanderthal skulls. But you can see then they have a household, because there's his wife or his spouse lying down on the ground. They've domesticated dogs. They've got stone tools. And so it really represents that this noble Neanderthal was a good ancestor. But right about this time, there were other ancient humans that were found in Europe, and these were in fact ancient humans. And this is a specimen from Cro-Magnon that's found in 1868 in France. And if we look at the cranium and the skull of this individual, we can see that this is recognizably human. It's got a globular vault, it's got a well-defined chin, the face is very flat, it doesn't have the brow ridges, has a vertical forehead. And so this then, excuse me, this then becomes evidence that there are other animals or other ancestors that we can choose from when we're describing the ancient Europeans. And in association with these Cro-Magnons, they found, and other early humans from Europe, they found a variety of well-formed tools. The one on the left is what they're referring to as a spear sharpener or a stick sharpener with a hole in the middle. But if you notice, it's very carefully carved, and there's a nice face of an ibex that's on the front of this straightener. And very well represented. And also on the right side of the slide, these are stone blades. And so this is when you're flaking a rock, what they're doing is they're creating these flakes that are very, very long and thin. And these are technically very difficult to produce. And we never find evidence of either this representational art or these blades in association with Neanderthals. Other things we don't find in association with Neanderthals is this illustration of representational illustrations. It might be difficult to see, but this is actually a ancient proboscidean, ancient woolly mammoth, you can see here's his forehead, here's his eye, his tusks, his trunk, and then there's all the shaggy fur. And what this also realizes is how ancient these Cro-Magnons are, because what they are is they're being found in association with extinct animals that they drew because they saw them. And so we understand that these are very ancient animals. Other things that the Neanderthals were doing, or excuse me, Cro-Magnons were doing, is that when they were living in the caves, they were illustrating the walls of the caves very beautifully and with a great degree of realism and color. And so this is a cave painting, and we can see again how beautifully rendered these are, also illustrating some extinct animals, the orc here. So they're engaging in behaviors that the Neanderthals are not. Other things that we can see of the cave paintings are these outlines of hands. And so this shows how similar the Cro-Magnons are, because there's a sense of humanity in there, in the sense that we're looking at the hands. People are in some way, it's unclear what they're doing, but it could be a sense of saying that I am here, and that this is in some fashion a self-portrait, and something again we don't see in the Neanderthals. So when we think about the Cro-Magnons, they had a very they were more nobler than were the Neanderthals, and so when we reconstruct what they look like, they have very upright faces, very lots of they're well groomed. They also have lots of personal adornment, as you can see by the man on the left. And so the idea is that what we've done is that we now have a truly noble and recognizable European ancestor. And so consequently, Neanderthals' view went the other direction. And so these are a couple of illustrations from the 19th century and early 20th century. And what we find is now, instead of the nobleness of Neanderthals being emphasized, what they're doing is the primitive nature of this. And we can see that they're not standing up erect. They don't have that intelligent look on their face. They're hairy. They just don't look like Europeans anymore. And so this was the case where, when we're starting to see that Neanderthals, instead of being an ancestor that we embraced in our family, that this was a different type of hominoid, and that it was not something that was treated very well. So in science, we always say that if we find more data, maybe we'll overcome these problems. And so in 1911, a skeleton was discovered in France at LaChapelle. It's referred to as the Old Man. It's a significantly complete skeleton. And so we figured maybe this will rehabilitate the Neanderthals a little bit. Well, this is what a comparison of the skulls. We have a Cro-Magnon, as you can see on the right, Neanderthals on the left, and you can just see some of the skeletal differences or cranial differences between the two. So which one would you choose as an ancestor? Yeah. And so when the anatomist, anthropologist began describing the LaChapelle skeleton, he described it a couple different ways. If I may quote, "The great development of the face, the backward position of the frame and magnum, which must have caused the body to incline forward, the slighter curve of the cervical and lumbar regions of the vertebral column, and its distinctly simian arrangement of the spinous processes of the cervical vertebra all testify to this fact." Also, although bipedal, the anatomical characters of the femur and the tibia, seen in profile in the upright position, show that the leg and thigh, when extended, could not have been a precisely straight line with each other, as we see in modern humans. The foot, still only slightly arched, must have rested on the ground in its outer edge. It must have assumed naturally an in-toed position. The wide separation of the great toe shows that it may have played the part of a prehensile organ, in the same way that apes and monkeys are. So it's not. So what they were doing is, by the analysis of the LaChapelle skeleton, it emphasized its primitiveness, its non-humanness, and again reinforcing the idea that the Neanderthals were not like us. So here is Boole's reconstruction of Neanderthal on the left with modern humans on the right. We can see that it's slightly stooped, knees are bent. And so not only did Boole's reconstruction, not only his reconstruction, this then became the way everybody viewed Neanderthals. And this was a three-dimensional reconstruction on the left that was in the Field Museum. And again, has the dim-witted appearance, slumped over shoulders, knees are bent, so it wasn't like a modern human at all. And then things really got worse when we went to Hollywood. And so, of course, they took advantage of all the worst things that we were thinking about Neanderthals. without morals, rapacious, just evil beasts. But beginning in the 1960s and the 1950s and 1960s, Neanderthals started becoming rehabilitated again. Analyses of the original LaChapelle skeleton realized that many of the anatomies were based on pathology and not real anatomy. And so the idea became that these were really our close cousins. They've got large brains, and if we could only put a hat on them and dress them up, then what would happen is we wouldn't be able to distinguish these Neanderthals from other people that we see and are walking around day to day.
When they found the very first Neanderthal skulls, the very first ones, what made them think it was a different species as compared with a deformed or diseased skull from a person? I mean, those things did exist. What made them think that it was an ancestor of a person back in the very first ones?
So it's actually at the Engies, a place in Belgium, what they did was actually at that site they found a Neanderthal juvenile, but they also found higher up in the sequence a modern human. So the idea was that it was thought that because it was a juvenile individual, that maybe it just hadn't grown up to be a full adult. So that'd be age-related changes. There was also some recognition that, in fact, some of the early anatomies of LaChapelle and other specimens were a consequence of pathology. And so that what we would say is, oh, that this is a deformed human or a deteriorated human with arthritis and all sorts of problems, which they did have. Neanderthals exhibit lots of fractures, lots of arthritis, lots of real health problems. So you can know how those types of changes to your life really bend you over and bow you over and change the way that you look. However, when you started finding more and more and more and more of these specimens where the pattern was repeated in a very characteristic way in association with the stone tools, it became more apparent that this was a pattern. You couldn't then write off every individual skeleton as a pathology when you have dozens of these specimens. And also, the Neanderthal really wasn't named as a separate species until the 1860s, when it was recognized as something different.
Two-part question. How were the teeth of the Neanderthals different than the Cro-Magnon, and what were they eating?
The second question I'll answer first. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a discussion on what do Neanderthals eat. And so what I'll do is I'll defer that to 2 weeks from now. The Neanderthal teeth there's some minor differences in terms of the details of what the incisors look like. They're basically shovel-shaped incisors. Some of the molars are larger in crown size. There's also some details in the morphology of the crown root of the crowns. Also, Neanderthals have something which is referred to as a taurodont molar. And what it means, if you look at a molar tooth, I'm not asking you to rip a molar out of your head when you go home, but if you look at like your maxillary molars, your upper molars, what you do is you've got a crown, you have 3 separate splayed roots in there. What we find is in Neanderthals, those roots tend to be fused together, and you've got what's known as a very large pulp chamber. So that what you can do, for parts of the Neanderthal dentition, you can identify it as being Neanderthal or not based on an individual tooth. But for some teeth, like the incisors or the canines, or even in some cases the premolars, it becomes very, very difficult. The other thing in terms of its sort of diet is, and you'll see this in some other slides, is that Neanderthals tend to wear their teeth very flat. So they must be doing something in terms of eating a high gritty diet that requires a lot of grinding so that they're wearing their teeth flat over time. And also, I don't know if you can be able to tell from the slides we're showing, is that Neanderthals also are using their anterior teeth as tools. And so in fact, what they'll do is they'll wear out their front teeth before they wear out their back teeth because they're holding stuff with them or using them as tools in some way. So there is a lot of manipulation of their environment through their mouth.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Dr. Scott Simpson discussing the 19th century discovery of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon skeletons in Europe. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Simpson will tell us more about our Neanderthal cousins, who they were, where and how they lived. Now, back to the talk.
So let's talk about where the Neanderthals live in space. They live on the north side of the Mediterranean in Europe and the Middle East, and they also drift a little bit into Central Asia. Each one of these dots represents one of the major Neanderthal archaeological sites or paleontological localities that we can see, although this by far is not a comprehensive at all. There are lots and lots of other localities where there's just a handful of artifacts found, but we do know Neanderthals from a nice big sample. We have about over 400 individuals are represented from all the collections that we do have. We can talk about their origins and their extinction, but their extinction has recently been revised to about 40,000 years ago. So we'll do a parade of some of the fossils. This is Gibraltar. One of the first specimens was found before the Origin of Species was published. The bottom picture is Gibraltar Caves, where it was discovered. We see that the caves now are pretty close to the waterline, but when these individuals were living 40,000 years ago, water levels were lower, and the caves were a little elevated up off of the above water, so they overlooked the Mediterranean instead of drenched in it. Some of the anatomies we can see, again, it's got a long, low vault, big face, a large nose, has some brow ridges associated with it that we don't see today. Other fossils we can look at are Neanderthal man. This is from the Neander Valley. On the left is a line drawing of the clot or top of the individual's vault, again emphasizing the long, low appearance. But it was also found in association with much of the rest of its skeleton. So we really know not only about the head of Neanderthal, but we're starting to look at aspects of its pelvic morphology, its limb proportions, its overall stature, its mass, its robusticity, and also some evidence of injuries that Neanderthals have had. Here's a close-up of the LaChapelle skull. He is often referred to as the old man. Up here we can see that he's edentulous. He's missing all his teeth on the left side of his jaw and on his maxilla. This anatomy here is what has happened. He has lost all his teeth early in life and has got a resorption of all the bone, of the alveolar bone in his jaw. The anterior teeth are worn down to nubbins, and so that he was having a hard time being able to process his food in order to survive. Another very interesting site is a place called El Cedrón in Spain, in northern Spain, right on a pretty part of Spain. It is known for there are dozens of individuals. Excuse me. There are a couple of dozen individuals from this site. The bone is beautifully preserved to the extent that what we can do is we can actually withdraw DNA from the specimen so that we can begin looking at the genome of these ancient animals. We also find that there's cannibalism going on at this time period, so it's a very, very important site. This is a very interesting specimen in southern Italy, Altamira. And this is a skeleton that's still in the ground in a karstic cave, a limestone type of cave. And what this is carbonated accretions or calcite concretions that are on the surface of the specimen. And what had happened is this individual had gotten trapped in the cave or fell into the cave and died there, and his entire skeleton is there. And so far, all they've removed is a part of his scapula, which they used for dating and some anatomy. But when this comes out, this will be one of the most beautifully preserved and complete Neanderthals. Some other specimens we have from Croatia, from maybe between 42,000 and 125,000 years ago at Krapina. Krapina is also known as another cannibalism site that was discovered back in 1899. But moving over into the Middle East, we also find some specimens from Israel, northern Israel, at Kobara. And Kobara, as you can see, is a significantly complete skeleton. Has all its ribs, has its little hyoid bone up in the neck, has a significantly complete pelvis. And so that we're beginning to say something about the body plan and shape of these Neanderthals, even though we don't have his head. Another specimen from northern Israel is Tabun. From 120,000 years ago or so. It's not as well dated as we'd like, but again, it shows this classic Neanderthal, long vault, brow ridges, et cetera, et cetera. So if we want to get back figure out, so what is it that makes a Neanderthal a Neanderthal? So, I know a lot of you are birders and naturalists, and so that you all have field guides to everything. So we'll do a little field guide to a Neanderthal just in case you ever come across one. And one thing we find is that their brains are larger than ours. Human brains are about 1,350 cc's to 1,400 cc's or so. And Neanderthal brains, for the most part, are 1,400 cc's and larger, up to 1,750. So that's quite big, or as we say here, it's about 10% larger. Their vault, again, even though the brain is larger, it's packaged in a different shaped container. It's long and low. which is very primitive. It's very similar in some ways to Homo erectus and other early ancestors. It's got a very big brow ridge, a supraorbital torus or superciliary crest. It look like a couple of rainbows on above your eyes. Also, the vault, as a consequence of being low and long, it also has instead of being rounded in the back as is ours, it comes more to a bump or a bun in the back. And that's emphasized because there's a slight hollowing above this bun. And again, this is anatomy that we see again and again and again, whether it's in Western Europe or in the Middle East. The face is very projecting. It sticks out more than ours. It's our very flat face. And when we see in other images, we'll see it has a very big nose, has a large sized nose, both in area and cross section. And it lacks a chin in the same way that we have that mental eminence as we see in humans. So here's a picture. Actually, these are pre-Neanderthals, or very early Neanderthals from northern Spain, but they exhibit some of those characteristics that we see of later Neanderthals. It's absent a chin. It's not necessarily receding as we'd see in an ape, but it doesn't have that prominence that we see in modern humans. It's got a hole here, which we all have. It's called the mental eminence, and it's very large in Neanderthals, and there's some stories about why it's so big in these animals, perhaps as a cold adaptation. And also its position is very characteristic in Neanderthals. And also we find that Neanderthals, with their projecting face, that means all their dentary is anteriorly projecting. And behind their third molars and anterior to the ramus of their mandible, we have space called the retromolar space. And this is something that is not present in humans, but is characteristic of Neanderthals. So here we have some reconstructions of brain size of Neanderthals. Humans are on the right. Neanderthal is on the left. Again, you can see that the shapes are a little different, and Neanderthals are a little bigger. Now, we can do some arm waving and make some inferences about the capacities of Neanderthal based on the outer shape of the vault, but that's very difficult. There have been discussions saying that Neanderthals had better eyesight than modern humans, but they didn't have, their hearing wasn't as good. Also, their associational parts of their brain weren't as well defined or enlarged as modern humans. Their cerebellum is smaller. But it's very difficult to actually find this out. What happens is when we find our frozen Neanderthal in Siberia, and melting out of some glacier, that's when we'll learn a lot about their brains. But it's very interesting, what do they do with a brain so large if it's not as sophisticated as in modern humans. So this is one thing. What they figure is that Neanderthals, their brains were adapted to hunting, making tools, and building, but humans, as you can see, because we're adapted, it's charisma, image, and sarcasm. So in part of that rehabilitation of Neanderthals is that we can flesh these skulls out in the same way that we do forensic reconstructions of faces of the Neanderthals. And so we can take the skulls, figure out estimate what the muscle and skin thickness would be, and build this up into a lifelike representation. And so we can see that this is a face that we would recognize. This is a female from also part of that reconstruction. Some of the aspects we should talk about here are it has light-colored skin, green eyes, red hair, and really this is based on some of the paleogenomics that have been done in looking at the DNA, and they suggest that some of the differences between human DNA and Neanderthal DNA are reflected in the integumentary system, and so that may reflect a light-colored skin coloration. But what we can do is we can recognize Neanderthals in the historical record, not only by their bones, but by their tools. This is an Acheulean hand axe from 300,000 years ago, very well formed, about the size of your hand. And it's a very well-defined cutting tool made from a high-quality material. Now, Neanderthals aren't the only ancestors that made Acheulean hand axes. Hand axes go back about 1.7 million years, but Neanderthals, they continued this tradition well past 300,000 years ago. Other things that Neanderthals made are these Mysterion tools. Even though this doesn't look like much in terms of a broken rock, the sophisticated techniques necessary to make this flake are extraordinary, and any of us would be hard-pressed to do this today. But this, again, is characteristic of this Mysterion tool type technology tradition that we see in the Neanderthals. Something the Neanderthals didn't do And that's what would make these stone blades, these long, thin, broken rocks that are very sharp on either edges. Now, what will happen is that when we find these in the historical record, we know that this is evidence of modern humans that have made it into Europe. Other things that then becomes an interesting question is, do Neanderthals have any type of representational art? We know they didn't paint on caves, but do they have other evidence of caves, of individual ornamentation or representational art? And the answer is we're not sure. And beginning about 45,000 years ago in Europe, there's a new tradition called the Chatelperronian. And the Chatelperronian is, what they do is they have, these are 3 teeth, and you can see they have holes drilled in them or they've got notches around the edge. And it's thought that this was for making necklaces or some type of dangling type of jewelry. And the idea is that Neanderthals don't have any evidence of this until about 45,000 years ago. And it's unclear whether Neanderthals suddenly adopted this type of activities, behaviors, or that what they did was they learned this by interacting with the humans, modern humans that were moving into Europe at the time. And you can find a debate on either side. So it's really unclear, even though there's lots of archaeological record in Europe, we really don't know whether the Chatelperronian is associated with Neanderthals or not, or modern humans. Wall art is something else we don't see in the Neanderthals. This is something from Gibraltar Cave. These are scratches that were drawn on a wall that was on the floor of a cave that was underneath 39,000-year-old dirt. And so the only individuals that could make this would be the Neanderthals. And so there's a lot of, is this wall art? Is it representational? Is it anything at all? We don't know, but all we do is we can pretty much associate this with the Neanderthals. Other things that the Neanderthals do is, this is the remains from Shanidar 1 burial up in Iraq. And if his head's on the right, arm's on the left, his head is battered. If you look closely at his skull, difficult to see in this slide, it looks like when he was a child he got a blow on the left side that perhaps damaged his eye and blinded him, and perhaps even gave him brain damage. If we look at his humeri, his upper arm bones, this isn't broken by fossilization, that's its actual anatomy. And what has happened is you can see that it's very thin, it's broken, and it's thought that he was subject to some developmental disruption in his arm and suffered a surgical removal. If you want to call surgical removal by Neanderthal surgical, it's of the arm. And so the idea that he lived for a very long period of time with perhaps blind, perhaps some mental brain damage that left him with locomotor problems, a withered arm, a bad arm, and so perhaps shows compassion or it shows care for one Neanderthal for another. Another is burial, Shanidar 4, that this individual was thought to be associated with flowers as part of the burial process. And what happened when he buried in a grave, which is itself a sense of compassion, then what you'll find is that they added flowers and fruits to the grave. Unfortunately, recent analyses suggest perhaps these were introduced by rodents that were living in the cave and brought these things in, but it still makes a very nice story for the first flower child. Now, the other thing is, even though there's lots of good news about Neanderthals burying each other and comparing with a lot of compassion, they ate each other. This is Moula-Guercy in France. If you look at the bones, the human bones, the Neanderthal bones, they're broken and cut marked in the same way as the animal bones are in the cave, indicating they were treating the Neanderthals and the deer in the same way by eating them and processing them. This is found in other sites like Crépina, El Cedron, and also up in Marillac in France, where you can also see evidence of cut marks on the bone, where they're using stone tools to deflesh and take apart the bodies. So when we talked about the Neanderthals, we have this big blue blob that drifts off to the right of the map into Asia, but I don't have any dots there. And part of the reason is that the dots that are there represent fossils or archaeological sites that are ambiguous. We don't know whether these are Neanderthals or not. But we still have the range extended out that far. So how did that happen? Well, there's a cave in the far west called Denisova. There's also another cave called Okladnikov in Siberia. Both are dated about 50,000 years. And what has happened is that they've found non-diagnostic bones from individuals that were there. So they can't tell whether it's a Neanderthal or modern human or not. But what you can do is the DNA was preserved. And by looking at the mitochondrial DNA, they found that, in fact, these Denisovans, which are way out in Siberia, have the same DNA as Neanderthals in Europe. And so what this does is this links the Denisovan site as a Neanderthal, even though we don't have good fossil record for it, with everything else throughout the circum-Mediterranean area, on the north side of the Mediterranean. So some of the things we'd like to talk about in summary with the Neanderthals: they were big game hunters because we find them in association with lots of big animals that they've clearly hunted. They had controlled use of fire. They experienced high rates of trauma. We can look at their fractures of in their bodies. But is there evidence of compassion? They buried the dead, and they cared for the wounded. So this is something that's very familiar to us. But they ate each other, which in some sense is also familiar to us. But there's no real evidence of symbolic activity unless we believe that there's the Château-Perronian is truly a Neanderthal tradition. But then the tool types that we find in late Neanderthals are also very similar to humans, modern humans. So perhaps they're learning. There is some interspecific communication and language. Do we have language? We don't know. But I'm hard-pressed to figure out what else you have a big brain for other than language.
Are the female Neanderthals, are their pelvis structures larger to have this robust baby, or might the babies be even more immature at birth than human babies and smaller? Do we know at all? Great question.
I'm really interested in the evolution of childbirth. The answer is, what we do is there is some dimorphism in Neanderthal pelvis. And so what we can find is that one of the things that we see in Neanderthal pelvis is that their birth dimensions, the bony birth canal, is larger than it is in modern humans. It's wider. The pubic symphysis is much larger than it is. The other thing that we find, though, is the factors that are compromise modern human birth is our large brains and our broad shoulders. Neanderthals were big, stocky individuals, so even their babies are big, and we have evidence of what their babies look like because we have young skeletons of these individuals. We also know that we have some skulls from very, very young Neanderthals, so they also had very big brains. So what we find is that there were, like in modern humans, there was this selective balance between how big the babies get and how big the pelvises are. And it's represented in that Neanderthal pelvises are also dimorphic as they are in modern humans, showing that there is selection acting on increasing the size, maintaining the competency of the female pelvis.
Is there any evidence of Neanderthals living in North America? And if not, why not?
So there, excuse me, there is no evidence of Neanderthals living in North America. They seem to be just limited to Europe. We don't have any good fossil record of any human or human ancestor living in the New World prior to 13, 14, 19, 23,000 years ago, depending on your analysis. So the Neanderthals went extinct by 40,000 years ago. The first individuals making it in the New World are maybe 20,000 years or 23,000 years ago. So we just have found no evidence of that. It would be great. It'd be front cover of Nature if you found one.
Is there any possible alternative to the cannibalism hypothesis? Could there have been some ritual preparations that could have involved removing flesh from bones, or is there no hope for that?
I don't know. Perhaps I'm predisposed to accept cannibalism. I just am. But the model that they used at Mulagersi is that they analyzed the location of the cut marks and the pattern, frequency and pattern of long bone breakage in the deer and in the humans. And what we find is that they were treated indistinguishably. So meaning that when they were breaking up the deer for food, because we don't think there was any ritual associated with that, they were then breaking up the humans, or the Neanderthals, in the same exact way. And we find this again and again in the other different caves. Now there is evidence in other species and modern humans where there is this ritual defleshing and long-term handling of skulls over many, clearly years. What they do is they get polished because they're being handled for so long. But we don't see that evidence, certainly at some of the cannibal sites that I named.
Going to the trauma, has anybody bothered to figure out where this came from? Could it have been from hunting accidents with large animals, or could it have been with conflict with other individuals or tribes or what have you?
A lot of people spend time thinking about the nature of the trauma. What we find is that the frequency of trauma is very, very high in these individuals, and many individuals have trauma. A lot of these are bangs on the head, where you'll see indentation fractures on the head. A lot of them are fractures of the major long bones. There is an individual who has a piercing wound in his ribs that's left over from that's thought to be someone stabbed him. But it was a rough and tumble life back in those days, and so we don't know. We don't know until we get the memoirs, the Neanderthal memoirs.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Scott Simpson. Dr. Simpson is a research associate of the Laboratory of Physical Anthropology of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. In the second part of our talk, we learned about how and where Neanderthals lived. In our final segment, Dr. Simpson will discuss where Neanderthals came from and what happened to them. Now, back to our talk.
So what I'd like to do is, at this point, move on for the final section of the area. And so it gets to the idea is, where do the Neanderthals come from? Now, as we know, humans and our ancestors originated in Africa. And yes, going back 6 million years or more, and that we're starting to find evidence of hominins and human ancestors outside of Africa beginning about 1.75 million years ago. And we're starting to find this up in the Republic of Georgia. A little later, 1.6 million years ago in Java. In Europe, the evidence is a little more tenuous. But we are starting to find evidence as early as 1.4 million years ago of humans in Europe. There's some stone tool sites. There is an artifact site with an enigmatic remain. And so we are starting to see that there are populations from which the Neanderthals could arise from arising in or living in Europe prior to 1 million years ago. One of the best places for looking at the origins of Neanderthals specifically come from northern Spain, a place called Sierra de Atapuerca. And they have a couple of localities there, and one is called the Gran Dolina, which is dated about 900,000 years ago. And the other is the Sima de los Huesos, that's now dated 430,000 years, or maybe a little older than that now. And so these sites, what they do is they have remains, skeletal remains, that we can then examine and compare with later Neanderthals. The Gran Dolina site does not have that many remains, but it does have a couple of important ones, including this juvenile partial cranium. And so even though it's a juvenile, we can see some evidence of the facial morphology, the size of the nose, the way that the cheekbone meets the face, just the inflation of the face, that it looks like it could be a Neanderthal type, could be a Neanderthal ancestor. In fact, this has been assigned to a species called Homo antecessor, and Homo antecessor was originally described as being ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. But if it has Neanderthal traits, identifying Neanderthal traits, what it means, it's probably already derived in that direction. So that it could be an early Neanderthal, although we'll stick with its existing nomen. But a much more interesting site is the Sima de los Huesos, pit of bones in Spain. This is a very, very interesting site that is truly a pit at the, it's now hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of meters in from the opening of the cave. So it's very difficult to get to the pit of bones. Now, and in this small pit, which is small, perhaps as big as this corner of the room, they have remains of 3,500 hominin bones or bone fragments, representing over 28 individuals. And it's unclear how these individuals got in there. They were either drug in and dropped into the pit by their family, their kin, or that there was another new or an unknown access to the cave, perhaps some chimney, which they were also dropped in. But it's thought to be perhaps evidence of like a poor man's burial in the sense that you already have a pit, let's put the bodies in there. But it's also symbolic in the sense that because it was so difficult to get there and so difficult to get the individuals there. On the right side, that's a picture of what the excavation looks like, and it's very, very difficult and trying circumstance, especially if you're claustrophobic. They're also associated with the hominin bones in there, the remains of 150 cave bears. And it's thought that the cave bears, what they did was they smelled the rotting flesh, followed it, went into the cave, and then dropped into the pit and couldn't get out. And so that there's evidence of trampling of the bones. There's also scratch marks on the wall indicating that the cave bears tried to get out. And so it was a death trap for these bears, which is very interesting because those are the only other animals that are there. But if we look at some of the crania here, there are a number of well-preserved crania from Atapuerca. We have a juvenile in the upper left, a couple of other individuals, including an associated cranium and a mandible. Perhaps the best preserved individual is cranium number 5. It's a big male from the site. Also there are a number of elements that have been recovered from the site that were associated with this cranium number 5, so we can build an entire individual for the Sima. And so it is thought to be a primitive Neanderthal simply because it shares so many traits in terms of the face, the nose, the brow ridge. The big difference has to really do with the size of the brain. And because it's so much older, 100 or 200,000 years older than other Neanderthals, you could expect some degree of primitiveness by the Sima specimens. What is also interesting about these individuals is that there's a lot of size dimorphism or size variation, sexual dimorphism in the remains. So it's thought that the one individual on the left is a female, the individual on the right's on the male. So it's not all individuals the same size, just as in modern humans, big males and smaller females. And because we have 28 individuals, and because we've got lots and lots of bones from these individuals, we can say something about population variation. That's very important. So let's talk about humans now. Now, this is a distributional map looking at the genotype of mitochondria of humans. And what we can do is you can look at the DNA sequences in our mitochondria, those organelles in our cells, and look at the variation and reconstruct a pattern of who's related to whom and turn that into a clock of how and when people moved around the landscape. Analyses of the mitochondria DNA suggest that modern humans arose about 125 or 155,000 years ago. As a paleontologist, I'm more comfortable with the idea it's a little older because we've got some good fossils that are 160,000 years old and 195,000 years old that really look like modern humans. But following this through, if you look at this mitochondrial clock, you can see that it's thought that humans, as we know, the modern humans, us, left Africa about 60,000 years ago. And so again, that provides a timetable for looking when humans spread across the world and into Europe itself. Now, what's very interesting, we're always looking for fossil evidence to demonstrate when humans left Africa. And recently, a cranial fragment was found in northern Israel at Manat Cave of a modern human. It's dated to 55,000 years ago, and that's going to be the subject of next week's talk. So looking at how modern humans come about. Now, when we look at the Neanderthals, excuse me, we can look at it over a timetable. And so we have the Mysterion. These are locations of sites and the frequency of artifacts and density of localities from these areas. And Mysterion means Neanderthal. Chatelperronian maybe mean Neanderthal or humans, but it might even mean the interaction between the two. And Elusian is an early technological tradition associated with modern humans. So if we see green, that means we're modern humans only. And at 45,000 years ago, the only green we see here is in the southern tip of Italy. But as we go through, we're seeing now the Mysterion is becoming less common. The Chatelperronian and Elusian, the humans are increasing their distribution across all of Europe. And we're seeing by 40,000 years ago, we really are reduced to a single site of Mysterion site of Neanderthal site. And this is a new dating of all these sites. So this is the best evidence we have when Neanderthals went extinct, because if we were to continue this another 1,000 years, there'd be none. We would only have we wouldn't have the Chatelperronian, we'd only have the association of the early modern humans. So let's talk a little bit about genetics. So we talked about the toe bone from Denisova, how we could look at its DNA, and we said, its DNA looks just like it looks like a Neanderthal. Therefore, we can link this site in Siberia with the sites in Europe. Now, what's really curious about this cave in Siberia is that there other remains are found, including this tiny, tiny finger bone. That's an anatomical position on this individual, and they also found a molar. So when they did the analysis of the mitochondrial DNA in these individuals, they found, in fact, it wasn't a Neanderthal at all. And it wasn't a modern human. The mitochondrial DNA was so different from Neanderthals and modern humans, it suggested it comes from a completely unknown population. In fact, the mitochondrial DNA was as different from more different from Neanderthals than humans are from Neanderthals. So what we do is we've got a ghost population that we've identified based just on this DNA. Now, these two bones were found in the same stratigraphic sequence, well, within a couple of inches of each other. So we look at this mitochondrial linking tree, and we've got the toe phalanx, which was the original Neanderthal, and we link this with other Neanderthal specimens from Mesmaskaya and Vindija and Feldhofer, which is the original Neanderthal specimen. We can see that they're closely related together by how short the limbs are on the tree. The next link is similar to that modern humans, San and Yoruba from Africa, Han in China. And so that what we find is that the Neanderthals and humans are close related. And then on the bottom, that Denisovan finger bone is very different. So we've got this ghost lineage out there. Now, another curious thing is, so we looked at the DNA from the sites here at the Denisova, which out here in Siberia, and we figured out, oh, there's this Denisovans out there and Neanderthals out there. And what happens is that we've then compared with the DNA from the Sima, that 430,000-year-old cave in northern Spain. And so your expectation would be, oh, it's Neanderthal DNA. It's not. It's Denisovan DNA, mitochondrial DNA. So what we find is that at 50,000 years ago, there's these things called Denisovans that are in Siberia and in East Asia, as we know now. And its mitochondrial DNA is also found in the Sima at 430,000 years ago. And that's a real head scratcher, and we have to create a lot of, it's very difficult to try to create models how to explain how that similarity occurs. And that's what's curious is, remember, the toe bone and the finger bone, which were found in the same dirt, are more different from each other than they are from the specimen in Sima. And again, this just shows you how using a tree, linking us to the Sima is the stuff in Spain, how it is more similar to the Denisovans than it is to either the Neanderthals or the modern humans on the bottom. And again, just showing you that now paleontologists have a new question to answer. Go find these Denisovans. What do they look like? So the Denisovans, so you can now, because we've got good sequence, we have a complete Neanderthal sequence, we've got most of the Denisovan sequence of their nuclear DNA, we have their sequences for mitochondrial DNA, we can then compare them with modern humans. And what we find is that the modern Neanderthals share some, well, modern humans, non-African humans, share DNA with Neanderthals. And so that non-African modern humans have about 1% to 4% of their DNA they got from a Neanderthal ancestor. Curiously, these Denisovans, what they do is they share DNA, or individuals from Melanesia and Southeast Asia have Denisovan DNA. So even though that they're extinct, there was some interbreeding between humans, the Denisovans, and Neanderthals, and some of these genes are remnants, are left in our history. So when we look at the human and Neanderthal relationships, the old idea was that humans, it was a lineal change. So we had modern humans, we had Neanderthals, and then we had humans. And so Neanderthal was a stage of human evolution. And so it went extinct only because it became us. Another model that came out for what are the Neanderthals like is that, in fact, we originated from a common ancestor some long time ago in the past, and we had separate evolutionary perspectives and histories until about 40,000 years ago, when modern humans went into Europe, and somehow the Neanderthals went extinct. But now we understand it's a more nuanced model, is what we're finding, in fact, that when humans went into Europe, what we found is that, in fact, there's some interchange of genes, and in fact, Neanderthals didn't go extinct, they went extinct-ish. Because what they do is we still find some of their DNA in us. And to prove, if you'd like to do that, what you can do is you can pay $99 and you can go to 23andMe, or you can go to National Geographic, take a swab from your cheek, and they'll figure out how much of a Neanderthal you are. And so again, thank you very, very much.
This lecture is part of the Origins Science Scholars Program of the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream. It has been brought to you with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.